record this. So I want to make sure that we record this for Kate. Okay, so again, talking about section in this section perspective, LTL Architects, I'm going to show some examples and talk just a little bit about some of these, what a really good section drawing can do. I'll just zoom in on this one, for instance. Here's another one from LTL Architects. They're famous in that they're really good sort of set of designers. They're all three of them are academics. I think one of them was chair at Princeton for a while, and so they're major sort of movers and drivers, both as educators and as practitioners out on the East Coast. And then they also came out with a book called Manual of Section, published by MIT Press, or maybe it's Princeton Architectural Press. I can't remember which one. One of those really good publishers. But looking at the sort of section cuts drawings through really famous pieces of architecture and sort of interrogating section as a sort of representational method for both communicating spatial ideas as well as generating spatial ideas, right? And so here's an idea that you can see here. This was a particular building scheme. I don't even know what this was for, but again, look at how much information you can show on a section, particularly in this case, a section perspective. You can start to show the street, how I enter, which looks like it's underneath this sort of folded concrete structure that sort of starts as ground, folds up, and then folds over as canopy, right? At the same time, part of the facade starts to step up, right? As sort of stairs and a sort of terrace or amphitheater, right? Sort of public space, outdoor public space that sort of takes you out onto a sort of elevated outdoor space with a pond and some bamboo, it looks like, or something sort of planted along here, right? And so there's this idea of sort of lifting people up off the street and creating even more public space up above, right? And propping it up over the entrance, right? So I can go under, right? And get into this sort of cavernous sort of lobby with some cafe seating and things like that. Or I can go over and around and on top of and start to experience sort of more outdoor public space, but on top of the building itself, right? So building, roofscape, building, sort of lifting up and sort of making an incision almost, it looks like in the ground plane, and sort of lifting it up and inserting architecture underneath, right? And then sort of making the top of the architecture landscape again, right? Or part of their urban streetscape. But this idea then that we have volumes of glass up above, you can start to see that there's several different things, right? There's a sort of a front of house and then a back of house. You can see that back behind here, there's service and parking, right? So you can see a sort of elevated parking ramp. And then over the parking, then we have more building, right? And so it looks like there's actually a sort of little outdoor courtyard or some sort of light well, right? They can see with glazing, right? And so you can see exactly sort of how this thing situates itself in the site, and then what's going on the inside as well as the outside, and how you can play games between the inside and the outside, right? You can have the inside open out to the outside and continue the inside out with a grass lawn and sort of things like a koi pond or whatever this thing is. I'm not sure, right? Where you want glass, almost a window wall, quite literally, versus where you want solid parts. Here you can start to see, I know, again, a clear separation between the sort of front of house and back of house, and so on and so forth. You can start to see overhangs. You can start to see patio and deck opportunities, right? So when I look at your massing models and I say, where you're making massing for, like, let's say hallways and corridors, just remove the hallway and corridor stuff. The space in between, right, is where you can start to think about both vertical and horizontal or lateral sort of circulation, hallways, spaces, atria, light wells, courtyards, those sorts of things, right? And when you cut these things open in section, you really, I think, start to understand, right, that interesting architectures are interesting in section, right? I mean, so you start to see a variety of different shapes and sizes and volumes, right? Space, different types of rooms, right? It's not just a layer cake, right? It would be really boring if this was just a layer cake and each floor was exactly the same as one below it, and there was no dialogue back and forth between them, right? But instead, we have a sort of multi-story space that we enter into. We have parking ramps that split level. We have parts where the inside becomes outside. We have places where things get tall and I can actually look out windows and see a space, part of the other side of the building, across a courtyard, or walk out onto a balcony that actually has, a nice sort of outdoor pleasant space there. Balconies and things like that, right? And so again, I'm repeating myself several times here, but you can begin to sort of understand, I hope, when you start to look at really good, rich building examples, and sort of understand the logic of them by reading the drawings, right? And so these drawings, I would argue, in this section in particular, not only helps you sort of communicate these ideas, but helps you generate them, right? As soon as you get this drawn, you can start to push, pull, tweak, blow out, certain, pull back certain floors so that you could create like, mezzanines over a larger sort of taller space. You can begin to, or project them through the facade. So you have like little outdoor balconies and porticos and things like that. So you can begin to sort of play games, and hopefully you can start to see these things as not something where you get everything, try to fully form everything in your head and then get it on paper, but getting it on paper and revising and developing and pushing and pulling and using these sort of strong, thinking about this in terms of sort of design verbs, right? It becomes a generative device, right? You can start to make really interesting design decisions as you start to develop, particularly the drawing in section, right? Here's another example. This, again, I'll start with a bunch of examples from LTL because they really sort of, for a long time, sort of were known for doing these sorts of section perspectives of these competition entries that they were doing, right? Look at this section. It's not boring at all, is it? There's a lot going on here, right? So we can see how this connects to the grounds and to the street, right? The road. We can see how we would actually enter underneath the canopy and then enter, and then we pass a threshold, we'd go up some steps, or some sort of stair ramp system. We would pass through glass, right? We understand that there's several different layers, and that, again, this isn't a layer cake. So there are certain types of, let's say, auditoriums and a grand staircase that sort of takes you up and through the building. We start to see some service areas. We start to see some taller volumes that step down to smaller volumes. We start to see inside spaces, and then outside spaces, and then hybrid spaces where they're sort of on the roof and they're covered with canopy, right? But they're kind of inside and outside. They're kind of sheltered, but they're also open air. We can see how the skin sort of gets perforated in certain places as louvers, or to allow a little more light in or less light in. We see this screen that wraps and becomes canopy, that wraps down to become screen, that wraps down again to become canopy, right? We start to see where, circulation and things like that taking place. We can start to see that there's, sort of back of house, and it looks like, again, more parking, a sort of parking garage underneath. Right? And so again, you can start to see a sort of rich spatial variety here where, it's like bump this up, carve this out, pull this floor slab back so that now we have a sort of really tall space along the perimeter here against this glass. Here again, make this a lobby that's sort of multi-floor that extends back beyond, but also connects up to a mezzanine above that takes you to a grand staircase that sort of wraps up and then around and then up again and around, right? And so you can begin to see sort of a really nice spatial complexity, right? Of how to begin to sort of think about what right now are kind of dumb blocks, right? And all the blocks are all the same heights. I would argue some of your blocks might need to be taller, right? And that's a challenge to you. To sort of think maybe a classroom is different than an office, is different than a gallery space in a museum, right? I mean, I think intuitively, if we were walking through some of these places, we would understand that and we could point them out, right? And it's really easy, but it's really easy to forget that when you're just sort of stacking blocks and doing an exercise and just ticking off the checklist of stuff to do, right? So I just wanted to bring this up. In section, you can begin to play these games. We were just talking about, Emil and I pushing and pulling on the facade, right? And the massing laterally. But here you can start to push and pull, carve, and combine vertically as well, right? And I think that's really important, particularly if you're going to be addressing light and you're going to be making some grand sort of monumental spaces in the inside of your museum, right? So just again, I'm repeating myself a lot here, but at this point, the vocabulary is just as much of a learning thing as the examples of drawings that we look at, right? When we talk about volume and void and section and poche and spatial interlock, and we start to use terms, that's part of the vocabulary of design and architecture, right? And so again, we're practicing that and trying to sort of expose you to that as well. Here's another example. Here's a great one. I love this, not because I think the building is all that great, but look at this. This is situated in urban environments, and I mean, in a really nice way, I think, right? It's talking about showing where the street is, the sidewalk, making an urban design move here, making a sort of backgrounds garden courtyard, right? In the space on the other side, right? Still in the same block, right? But between it and its adjacent neighbor building, right? It has a basement. We can start to see where you enter, right? We can start to see where you move up. We can start to see some repetition when it comes to program. We can start to see some repetition when it comes to program here and in here, right? And then we start to see some special stuff up here, right? And look at this. I mean, again, starting to give some thickness, right? Walls are skinny. Floors, that floor to ceiling sandwich and roofs, they're much, much thicker, right? Because if you don't add that detail and show the structure and show the cavities and show some of the systems running through here, right? You just poche it in, right? There's actually a lot going on in here. You can just sort of poche it in and it just becomes this really sort of thickened thing, right? All right, so again, I want you to expose you to really good sections because you start to understand that sort of figure ground relationship. Everything that's being cut that's solid, right? And then all the spaces in between. And it's those relationships, both in plan and section, that we're really trying to cultivate here, right? So we start to read this as a figure ground, right? Understand the sequence because I can understand how the space flows in and then through a switchback stair up and over, right? And then, I just accidentally clicked it. So it's taking me to where this was actually located. Let's take a look, right? Here's some perspective collages. Obviously not photo realistic, right? But highly communicative. So they're talking about some materials. They're emphasizing these warmer materials like woods, and then the cooler materials like glass, right? They're showing where they're going to put some softscape and sort of soften things up with plants, when they're trying to sort of populate outdoor spaces, right? And then indoor spaces, trying to show some textures and trying to show some of that spatial interlock, right? Where the stairs, I get up to the top of the stairs and I can look down over into the space that I was just in, right? Or this conference room, right? Sort of some strange visual adjacencies, even if spatially they're sort of pulled apart, right? Okay. Again, these are section perspectives, just a 1-point perspective, right? If I trace all these back, they go to all to a point, right? And you can see in this case, instead of using a bright color as the poche, the inside, right, is actually blinged out with all kinds of tones and color and materials. And then what they did is instead of the sort of the empty space is the stuff being cut, right? And so again, there's that contrast, even if they sort of flipped the convention on its head, right? So anyway, that was an accidental, just sort of like I clicked it and opened up, right? They have a lot of these, right? So you can begin to see, again, a 3-story atrium space here with catwalks driving through it, right? It sort of staggers every floor, like a floor for cars, a floor for humans, a floor for cars, a floor for humans, a floor for cars, humans, cars, humans, automobile, humans, right? They sort of weave parking garage and sort of nicer spaces back and forth. And instead of saying, okay, here's it is over here in plan, and here's the parking and here's the building, right? Or in section, here's the parking and on top we'll stack the building. They try to weave them together, right? Which is kind of an interesting thing as well. Park tower, get it? Park is in like park with trees, or park is in parking lot, like where to park your car. Haha. Anyway, right? Again, I think there's just a different section of the same scheme, the same idea, right? Carving out some outdoor spaces here, right? Seeing that big atrium where you start to see all kinds of circulation moving through. Right? That's good looking. Those are some good looking sections, aren't they? All right. Yeah, here's another one, Park Tower, right? But you can see just the several prototypical sections, right? Again, they're laying out that pattern of car, human, car, human, car, human, right? But some of the human stuff is like office or retail. Some of it's like outdoor public plaza space. Some of it's like pool, you know, with like a sort of like a huge sort of tall atrium space, you know, and just glass wall. So again, sort of thinking about, you know, how the program is stacked, and then just sort of structuring out the section, right, to sort of further delineate the idea, and then to further strengthen the idea, pushing and pulling, carving, combining, right, you know, sort of starting to sort of weave different spaces together in various ways in section, right? So I just wanted to show you those are some examples. And again, I'll post this to this video. All right, now I have a whole Pinterest board called Section Tableau, meaning that, you know, sort of these intricate, sort of really intricate sort of scenes like Tableau. And some oftentimes these are section drawings in here. Sometimes they aren't, they're like perspectives or something, but there's a lot of section drawings in here. And let's just take a look at, you know, there's no right or wrong way to do a section per se, right? But the key thing is that they contribute to this sort of main idea. So you'll see a variety here of like, you know, different types of geometries, different strategies for what's filled in or where to use tone, right? You know, where to use shadows or lighting or even color, right? Should it be a straight up, let me go back to that one. Should it be a straight up orthographic section, right? Or should it be a like a section perspective, right? So you can see this one's a section perspective, right? So sort of a section up front and then perspective as it moves back in sort of a three-dimensional view of things, right? Okay, and so again, I just wanted to show you some examples, right? Because you can see there's a sort of rich sort of tapestry of examples here, actually like laid out in a mosaic even, right? You know, of these sort of ideas of cutting section, right? You can see the ground, you can see these sort of massive buildings and the infrastructure of freeways underneath and things like that. These sort of speculative projects from a long time ago, actually. Let me back out. Let me try to find some specific examples that I think might be kind of interesting to look at and compare and contrast. Oh, I just hit back instead of, come on. So there's this one. Really? Okay, here we go. Sorry. There's this one. I've also included some sectional models, like physical models too, in some of these. So I might include those just so you can sort of see. Like, here's one. I think this one's probably just 3D printed, I think. Let's see. Here's another one. What's awesome is when you make a model that's in two parts and has a hinge, so you can actually open it up like a dollhouse. Anyway. But again, I just wanted to show you a sort of variety here. And let me know, I can always, here, actually, I can just do this right now. I can post the link to this in the chat as well if you're interested in looking at this later for some reason. But here, I just wanted to get a few examples up that we can take a sort of critical look at. Some of these I would say are better than others, right? Come on. Some of them are pretty weird geometries that are maybe not quite the same as some of the ones that you were looking at with boxes and planes, right? One of the things I want to highlight, and you'll see these in some of the examples as we start to go through them, is the sort of tonal qualities that you can start to give some of these spaces on the inside of the section, right? Almost like a secondary perspective where you can begin to talk about things like materials or darkness, contrast, heaviness, lightness, those sorts of things, right? Here's an example where the stuff that's being cut, except for the ground, is actually just white, right? And so then we start to see the spaces in between is rendered with like lots of different tones and textures, right? So we and you know, variety of light values and lamps and things like that, right? So again, this is sort of flipping the convention where typically we color in the stuff that's solid, that's being cut through, and then we leave open, you know, and the stuff that all the sort of volume, empty volume on the inside. This is sort of flipping that script just a bit, right? Again, here's another one where this is gorgeous, right? Even the ground is white, right? You can start to see how this thing is subterranean, then it pokes out of the ground and it starts to look like, is it architecture? Is it infrastructure? It's kind of a mixture of both. It's very evocative, right? Of this sort of, you know, machinery and sort of I don't know, kind of a darker aesthetic, right? This sort of industrial dark aesthetic, right? Here's another one. Here's thinking about a superstructure where instead of, you know, you could have these sort of gigantic farms under these sort of umbrellas, you know, these sort of architectural superstructures. So here's a cow mooing at you, London Energy Exchange, apparently. My guess is this has, you know, being that it's in London, maybe this was some sort of clever project trying to convert grass to cow farts to methane to energy or something. Who knows, right? Architects sometimes can be a little too cute for their own good sometimes. Let's see what else. Oh, that's interesting. That's just interesting color, but that's not really a section. Here's a section model, right? Somebody actually put together with, you know, maybe 3D printing, right? Here's another section model. Right now, here's a section drawing. I think is a really nice one. It's an orthographic drawing, right? But you see inside, actually, maybe it's a slight perspective, actually. Yeah, because it looks like the parapet goes back. Looks like some of this stuff goes back, right? Here, you know, again, the poche is used in a traditional way. Ground and walls and floors and ceilings and roofs are pocheted with black. On the inside, it's a little muddy, but you can start to see that they turned on some lighting and shadows, right? And so you can start to see some of the main pieces of geometry. You can start to see tall spaces, atriums with circulation. You can start to see the sort of where you have a sort of a layer cake or a stack of pancakes, so to say, where some of the floors are just repetitive, right? I hope this is helpful. You know, again, just to sort of see good examples of these sorts of things. Here's another section drawing. Again, not a boring section, right? So you get this, you go under the building, and then finally go up into the building. And then you get into the building, you get up to this platform, you understand that there's a hole through the building, right? And there's lots of different spaces here. There's stairs, there's performance spaces and theaters and amphitheaters. There's mezzanines that overlook other mezzanines, right? That sort of, you know, this sort of spatial interlock and sort of seesawing back and forth. You know, openings in the floor plates in certain places to make really tall, super tall spaces, or light wells, right? You can see structure and things like that inside. Now, here's one that I would say it's simplified compared to what we just saw, but I'd say it's deceptively simple, right? It's more subtle. But if you look at this close enough, you start to see more and more detail, right? So I think what's interesting here is that we have, you know, the ground is a sort of, you know, dark poche, but then with this sort of texture, right? We start to see building structure, these piles that are driven into the deep into the ground. We start to see the stuff that's actually being cut, again, is a sort of consistent white. Everything else is a sort of tonal values of gray all the way to black, right? So we get sort of light, brighter spaces and darker spaces. We start to see some things that beyond an elevation, right? There are subtleties here. We do have some scale figures, not many, but some. We actually have some vegetation at the ground plane, and some surrounding infrastructure. We have some elevation markers, some key elevation markers like top, where this sort of penthouse starts, where this section starts or this section starts, right? So they're sort of delineating, sort of base in several mid sections of the building and the top of the building, right? Again, simpler, looks simpler than the one we just looked at, but there's still some subtle details in here that are quite nice, right? There's some thinking behind this. This is one that lacks the poche, but you can start to see as a sort of blocked out in process section, a lot of detail in this. I don't know how helpful that is. Here's another one that looks like it's in process and was, this is actually, you can see, this is actually looks like trace paper, and you can see some of the construction geometry and some of this stuff, right? Okay, so this wasn't computer generated. This is more like a photograph or a scan from paper. Here you can see again this strategy of not poching the cut stuff, the matter, the sort of solid walls and floors and things like that, but leaving that blank. And so that way you can use tone in an expressive way on the inside to really sort of talk about the volumes and the surfaces on the inside and how light washes across them and things like that, right? And how deep certain spaces are, how dark they get or light they get. So again, it's about knowing the rules, and sometimes if you know the rules, then you can break the rules or do a variation on the rules, right? I would argue you have to know the rules really well first before you can really do that well, like break them in a special way, right? Here, let's read this, right? I mean, this looks like housing to me. So it looks like a bunch of stacked units. It looks like we have the sort of wet spaces like bathrooms stacked more or less. Looks like we have some bedrooms stacked. All the bedrooms need to have a window and a balcony out, right? Then it looks like on the other side, before we get to the other side here, we have a really super tall, narrow courtyard, right? So that the stuff on this side actually has a window, even if it doesn't even if it's not going to get a lot of direct sunlight, right? So there's a sort of density being spoken of here in this, in this section, right? Is a sort of really sort of dense, let's say, housing, building full of housing. All right, I'm not sure what that is. Now here's more of a traditional orthographic section, although there's lots of detail here, and again they're putting in shade and tone in the elevation stuff beyond, and a lot of detail, an extraordinary amount of detail, right? So here they're showing some sort of production facility, actually a set of production facilities, right? Interesting. This looks like actually reimagining the Bowery. I wonder if this is like this almost looks like food production, like hoppers for, or maybe it's a still or something for beer. I don't know. Maybe they're brewing lager in there or something. Oh, it beats me. Okay. So again, I'm just going to quickly sort of go through some of these other examples. Right here, this is like a plan section, right? It's plan section perspective where they're cutting through, and then you can start to see that this is a subterranean set of courtyards and interior spaces. And you have ground and you have, it's kind of weird, isn't it? Sort of playing games with this idea, right? And again, once you have a really strong grasp of these sort of drawing types and the conventions involved with them, then you really can use them to your advantage. Another set of tools in your tool belt, right? To communicate your ideas, to sell your ideas, right? Again, you can see here, uses of tone and texture and color in various ways, right? Here we have a darker sort of, large spaces. This almost looks like building as a machine or something. Yeah. Well, machines for living. There you go. Not a big surprise there, right? What's interesting about sections is, this sort of buildings like this, it's really important because of the relationship with the ground, right? Where half the architecture is inside the ground, and it looks like the ground actually, is part of the architecture, right? And so, starting to understand those relationships of where you actually pull back from the ground and carve out some light wells, or where you actually enter or descend into the ground on a ramp, or things like that, where there's courtyards, where you just add a sort of skylights and things like that. All right. Here's another section. Here's a section perspective, actually. Down here, you can see the ground plane is actually in perspective, right? But you can, again, see, boring sections are terrible, right? Like there's sort of layer cakes. These are not layer cakes. So we start to see that we have like sort of a pool here that sort of terraces downwards underneath this thing. We start to see that the ceiling above is actually this undulating floor for the space above it, right? We have cafes, that can sort of spill out on the sidewalk and bring people in from the sidewalk into the building, right? We have a performance space that they pass under. We have a lobby. We can see how they go up and up and up, right? We have terraces and balconies as these things start to step back from the street and get taller to the back of the site, right? So we can see a lot of things going on in these section drawings, right? I think that's the way to really think about the section, is something that you can do. It's not about quantity of them, right? Like the plans, it's just like cut a plan through every floor and let's see it. With the sections, it's like, let's have 2 really good sections and be very careful about where we cut them and then really develop them, right? And so quality over quantity when it comes to the sections, right? Here's another one where they show detail and the stuff that's sort of being cut through is white. And then that allows them to sort of make these sort of dark interiors with textures and shading and things like that, right? That's part of the it's part of the aesthetic of the inside, right? You can see there's some pretty weird spaces in here, right? And none of them are all closed off from the others, right? So there's a weird sort of interlock between this space that wraps around and down and then looks over this larger space, which connects to this smaller space that was underneath the space that we were above just a minute ago, that then connects down and through circulation down to the ground and even underneath the ground, right? And so, again, a section can help you sort of play these games and actually help you maybe even uncover, where you can actually go into the ground, right? The ground isn't this sacred thing that you can't dig into, right? So I just was going through Instagram and the other day we tried to do this and there's just so much there. I couldn't make any sense of what I wanted to look for. I was looking for something specific, but I was just clipping some examples right before class that I thought might sort of change the discussion here a little bit, because now we're looking at not only how these things, the blocks stack up, but what it's going to look like on the outside, right? I mean, we were just talking about, Emil was having that conversation just a minute ago, pushing and pulling, right? Maybe it's for performative reasons like shading and getting rid of some direct sunlight. Maybe it's about creating a view. Maybe it's about creating some overhangs or some balconies. Maybe it's about aesthetics. Maybe it's about creating shelter down below at street level. This I would say is an example of a smaller example of like a house, right? This is actually quite a big house, but it's small when it comes to our museum, of sort of showing a bunch of weird spaces just sort of stacked up in some sort of interesting way, right? And so, it's very expressive and sort of talking about, here's a specific space, and letting them sort of push and pull each other and seeing the individual volumes. Some of them are taller, some of them are more lateral, horizontal, some of them project outwards, some of them open up, some of them are more closed off in the back, or sort of heavier in weight. But this idea of expressing sort of a bunch of separate volumes, right, on the inside, but expressing on the outside, right, as part of the massing, right? Here we have a similar thing, sort of looking at different ways of sort of massing in planes, right, which is not unlike some of the things you were doing. All right, here we start to read massings, right? We start to see, first of all, sort of, we start to see some of the circulation and some of the core stuff that sort of moves up and down right here and through here. But then we start to read, on the elevation, various sort of volumes on the outside, right? So this one's very much looks like something that you would have done with your planar compositions, right? Sort of planes moving up and down, some moving horizontal. Maybe the vertical ones are stronger than the horizontal ones in some places, or vice versa, right? Okay, so again, thinking about some of the things you've already done, right? And how those could actually begin to translate into a building, right? Or a piece of architecture, or a museum, or a set of spaces, a spatial sequence, so to say. This is very much an introverted building, right? You look at the outside and it's like, what? Right, that's about as blank as you get, and austere as it can be, right? look at the inside, right? It's that sort of slot canyon idea with all these warm materials, right? Everything's sort of a more intimate scale. You start to see people walking back and forth along sky bridges, and things like that. And right. So that's what I mean when we were talking before about extroverted building versus an introverted building, right? Here's another introverted one. Here's a multi-story space where really sort of privileging all of this sort of circulation. How do I move back and forth, and how I move up and down and side to side, right? So this is a Zaha Hadid project, I believe. Yeah. Right. Here's another one where, again, we were talking about the sort of heaviness, right? If your idea is to have like sort of these big cast heavy shapes, right? And then sort of, really sort of tall volumes and let light wash across them, and to have more of an austere sort of set of surfaces so that the light is actually what we notice, and shadow is what we actually notice rather than any kind of texture or color, then, there's examples here to sort of look at, right? These sort of, and all these sort of weird spatial peculiarities, right? Putting a slit here so that we can actually bring just a little bit of light down, and you can see that that light actually can project down below here. Having something, having something orthogonal, and then you break that grid and rotate it one place. That becomes really special, right? And that's how you can begin to add emphasis when you break one rule. So you're consistent with the rules, and then you break it in one special place, right? That's how you can begin to create hierarchy and emphasis, right? It's not that there are no rules, it's that you carefully set up the rules, and then you can begin to play with the rules, right? So what I mean by rules is like, let's snap things to a grid. Let's keep certain types of spaces on this side of the axis and other types on the other side, right? Or in section, certain things along the courtyard and certain things above the courtyard, or however you want to sort of organize things, right? How you bring order to things, right? It's usually you make rules for yourself, right? So anyway, just sort of throwing that out there, right? So a very sort of, they start with a very sort of simple scheme, and then in a couple of places they start to break the rules, like the diagonal or a curve and a cutout, right? Something like that. Here we have another idea. Again, we were talking about these two planes that you sort of walk in between, right? And then that space in between is sort of monumental. If those things actually start to spread out or get wider and then get thinner, right? You can compress people down and then make them feel like really sort of, small, and then open it up back up, and, those sorts of things, right? You can, again, play games, right? And I don't mean that in a flippant way, but in a design way, right? Like, so you have a sort of set of moves you can make, right? To make spaces that people really love and remember. Okay, I think that's the best museums. The ones remember are the ones that either the exhibits were outstanding, right, were memorable, or walking through it was memorable, right? Here's another example of sort of a non-hierarchical stacking, right? So you get this sort of, there's a set of rules here, sort of an A, B, A, B, A, right? And then, but over here it might flip, so B, A, B, A, B, A, B, right? Like sort of this way and then that way, this way, that way. But how they stack up, and then having, sort of balconies over the, sort of open up on top of the thing below, and those sort of things. Those are all rules, but as a result, you get a sort of non-hierarchical sort of, my eyes can sort of see the forest. They don't pick out any particular tree as being more important than the other, right? And so again, you start to get a read of sort of stacked volumes, right? Okay, so again, talking about this stuff, looking at this, right? Here's a set of planes, and then, basically moving in this direction, there's a set of volumes. Right? I think these are actually supposed to be residential buildings, so apartment residences. I would say this is sort of bordering on science fiction in some ways, but, right, again, akin to looking at planes, right? So I saw that and I was like, oh, okay, I'll show them this, right? Here's an example of a section and elevation, right? So there's an elevation down below. There's a section, really sort of rich one, talking about sort of the spatial qualities and light qualities on the inside. That was by Allied Works, by the way. So for those of you who had some Allied Works projects for their presidents, this one looks so much like somebody did that planar exercise, that planar composition exercise, and then, extruded some things out, and then infilled some things with glass or clear planes, right, where there were openings. So I thought I would just include that, right? There are ways to take some of those planar compositions and begin to sort of, turn them into architecture. More section examples. Again, not a layer cake, is it? Another example of a sort of inside out project, right? That's sort of inside. Look at that. Unbelievable. That's where I want my office, inside here. This big thickened wood thing. Yeah, there's the garden on the inside, right? So instead of pulling the building back from the street and having an outdoor plaza or parking lot or something, right? Put it all to the edge and then put a nice courtyard on the inside. That's nice and warm and has wood and water and trees, some shade. So that again was a sort of insular building, right? Here's another section model. Again, not a layer cake, even with these living units. There's a repetition, but not a sort of flat stacked repetition. Okay, maybe some of these are less useful. Big spaces, right? Think about the stairway, not as like, the crappy stairway that you walk through in case of an emergency, but like, I mean, this is stair with a capital S, right? I mean, look at that. I mean, wow, that's monumental. Like that would be memorable. I mean, for me, it would. I don't know. I can't speak for you, but this is in Seoul, Korea. Let's see. Looking at how things can be stacked. Looking at how things can be. Now, before I mentioned, like, sort of having an expression of different spaces and volumes and things like this one puts a nice wrapper around the whole thing. And so, the exterior is expressed in a different way. It's not expressing a bunch of different discrete volumes on the inside, is it? But one large sort of volume pulled up from the ground plane, right? And then at one end it's open, right? Let's say that's the north side where we can actually put in some windows. And then along the east and west sides where we can just have some smaller vertical windows where we can actually put shades and things like that where we want, then we actually can open this up and sort of have just break up that big expanse with some smaller textures and just some smaller windows, trying to make windows in the desert, but in a more a responsible way, right? Like you can't just you can't just glaze everything, right? You can't put glass on everything. That would just be irresponsible. They won't even let you do it by code here. So, there's only a certain percentage of your building facade can be glass, right? Here's another example of sort of push and pull, Emil, and then push and pull on the sides too, right? So, there's an extreme version, right? With all these sort of cantilevers sort of pushing out, right? But it becomes part of the iconic nature of the building. It becomes part of the identity of the building for sure, right? Because it's so exaggerated. And then the sort of overhangs, the tops of the overhangs are populated. So it becomes green spaces and people, using them, right? More examples, screens and sort of reading of volume and sort of grid, but then rotated grid, right? So rotated this way, then rotated that way. You could glaze more and then add screens and shading devices and louvers along the outside, right? And actually think about it as a set of layers on the outside that sort of maybe allow views in one direction, but don't allow sunlight in the other direction or something, right? All right, so just wanted to bring some of that stuff up to your attention to sort of help us set the table for maybe a broader discussion for the rest of the semester on design. So we look at massing and form, right? Form meaning the shape of your building, right? So form, space on the inside, space, and then order, right? How those three things work together. What it looks like on the outside, how it works on the inside, how everything's sort of organized, right? So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to stop recording.